Welcome to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset, the leading data and analytics company for the cannabis industry.
So, Emily, did you hear the one about the D.C. lobbyist who enrolled in art school?
No, I didn't, Cy.
Yeah, well, I guess they heard there was a lot of sketchy work happening in D.C. and figured they'd better brush up on their skills.
Ooh, zing.
All right. That's not good. How about this one? Why was the Capitol building always tired?
I have no clue.
Because I had so many bills to sleep on.
Oh,
Yeah, we're just going to turn this whole thing into a comedy podcast. What do you think?
I think we shouldn't quit our day job.
Well, I do want to talk about DC and I do want to talk about bills. And I want to start by talking about your trip to Washington. So you were there for a few days?
Yeah, Morgan and I were in D.C. For a couple days last week, and this was driven by a business meeting that then we built political meetings around, which is, our old Poseidon always has this mantra of take the meeting, and it usually, there's almost nothing to be lost about taking an in-person meeting. Sometimes your dignity, but, I think there's always a lot of information gathered, and the meetings we took in DC last week actually came out of this event that I went to back in 2019. I remember it was September 12th because I remember I went from New York to DC, and I remember on September 11th, which I know was a special day for you, but
because it's my birthday, to be clear, not that sounded terrible.
That did sound terrible,
but it is my birthday. Yeah.
Yes. Well, but it was, I remember I rolled in and was very excited because I got, the email from Sorkin himself inviting me to participate in a roundtable discussion about banking. And it was when I arrived that it turned into what I perceived to be the sandbagging of a century, because I was sitting across the table from Alex Berenson and Kevin Sabat, who, if anybody hasn't listened to, I'm sure that people who watched the hearings in the Senate, which we'll talk about later, but I mean, it is a reality distortion field. But what that did for me is it befriended a colleague whose name is Rob Nichols. He's the CEO of the American Bankers Association. And the American Bankers Association, I feel like, is the unsung hero of the Safe Banking Act. They've been working really hard on this for the last couple of years, and it's born out of this. Look, they're very clear on the hill they're pushing this up, and it is very much about, this is a real industry of real size, and they deserve to have the banking infrastructure that any other business in the United States should enjoys. And this is actually beneficial from their point of view to the regulators, because it puts us in a less cash based business, and it also creates transparency on taxes, etc. So the organization has been incredibly articulate around this. They were working tirelessly through 2022. And the long story short is that I had the chance to sit down with Rob and then subsequently with multiple people who work with the ABA to try to understand how they're working to drive SAFE through the Senate. And he shared some really interesting tidbits with me about how hard this issue was, in fact, being pushed right through the final hours of 2022. And really helping me to understand actually what a champion Senator Daines from Montana has been of this issue, like really working at all hours of the night, trying to get an amendment in the horse trading that went down at the end of the year. And Rob told me, when I woke up in the beginning days of 2023, safe banking was my priority issue. Now, of course, since then, we've had a banking crisis. So, and in fact, last week while I was there, the CEO from Silicon Valley Bank was testifying. So things were pretty hectic for that. And then there's the debt ceiling. So a couple of insights from Rob, so far as it stands, he's been working with Senator Daines, and so has his whole team. They're great. And they're tracking kind of what could be the third rail issues, as I've called them, that could derail this whole thing. And they're working to make sure they get sufficient support on both sides of the aisle. The debt ceiling talks, which are going on as we speak, as of last week, he had the sense that they would probably end by, they would end this week or in the next week or so before we default, essentially, and it wouldn't get extended. And, unfortunately, he thinks it results in a downgrade, which I wouldn't be surprised, because it's not like we're doing that great on our credit worthiness. But that won't be cute to experience, but maybe
No.
necessary. But it
And
would be
it's so what,
good.
10 days away? Is that
Yeah,
the
I think it's
latest?
June. Yeah, 10
It's
days
coming up.
away.
Yeah.
And we only have a few more days while Congress is in session before they go on recess. So McCarthy and Biden, I know, are grinding on it tonight. And hopefully, I was joking with the team when the GOP stormed out last week. I was like, is this like when you go to the car dealership? Like, if you don't leave the dealership, did you even negotiate the price? Like, you got to have these like political things that go on. But so this is a priority for them, and they will be focusing all efforts once the debt ceiling is dealt with. He feels like the banking thing is starting to get stabilized, the broader banking crisis,
Sure.
and so this is resuming, and it's good timing because of where it is in the Senate. So that was a very good meeting. And then he was responsible for. Oh, do you have questions about
Well, the
Roth?
ABA, just, I mean,
Yeah.
to be clear, they represent like banks and credit unions, right?
Mhm.
Are they just one of the largest associations of banks and credit unions, or the largest? Is that
I think
right?
I think they're the largest. They have a
Yeah.
massive and beautiful office right in DuPont Circle, and they're very well regarded. And you can look up their commentary about safe banking over the years. It's very pragmatic. You know what was cool too that he shared with me, is that they've also been enlisting other industries. The economic impact of cannabis is so much bigger than just cannabis, right? It's over 100 billion is, I think, where the slated economic impact of this industry just within the four walls of the United States within 2023. And so he's had conversations with groups like what is it called, the shopping center associations, because a lot of cannabis dispensaries live in shopping centers across the United States, or the fertilizer association. Like, there's these different massive groups that do have relationships to cannabis that would benefit from us having better banking infrastructure around our industry. And so, as you and I have talked about before on the pod, it's good to get strange bedfellows in the room together. And so if senators can hear from different parties, not just the industry, that's very helpful to our cause. So I thought that was a really smart strategy on his part. So that was him. And so he introduced us to Senator Daines, because he's been working closely with Senator Daines, and Morgan Jason Wild, and Eric Luna, who's also been a great advocate. He works closely with Weldon Angelos. He's a lawyer. He's a constitutional professor at Arizona State. But he's doing a lot with Americans for Prosperity. Really amazing person, amazing legal mind. We got to sit down with Senator Daines and his chief of staff and hear directly from him about what the climate is like around this issue, and where we need to think about applying pressure and what we might need to avoid. And that was very enlightening. So just a couple of things. So far as SAFE exists as a narrow piece of legislation around banking reform, it has good support across the aisle.
Goods, like enough support, what you're hearing, or
Right
goods?
now, yeah,
Enough.
right now he feels like enough, but he's
That's great.
very intelligent in that he knows he has to keep pushing, because things always change. Like, look at what happened with the Veterans Affairs bill. A couple weeks
Right.
ago, they lost 3 votes, and that was the end of it. So they're going to push to have well beyond the required 60. So, they're making sure that the way this is evolving, and as the banking committee puts it forth, that it won't have become a Christmas tree with lots of ornaments hanging off of it. So far, according to him, the safe as it exists, plus plus Hope and Graham, is palatable.
Okay.
So what that means is there's language regarding firearm ownership, so it wouldn't preclude people from owning firearms. I believe is there's a lot of nuance to that language, and then also there could be some record expungement at the federal level around this. So, and that's Hope. So, however, he did caution that if we try to take either of those things too far, or anything around that too far, and it seems like it's starting to get like pork rolled or pork what is that called, like
Mm.
pork barrel, um then we could lose things. So he's going to try to work with the different parties. He said he gets the feeling that Senator Schumer understands this. And I know Schumer has spoken many times since the hearing a couple weeks ago that he does want to see like some criminal justice reform pieces included in this. And I'm just curious if he's just referring to the expungement or if he has something else in mind. But that'll be the thing to watch. And you know, yeah, so those are some of the highlights, and I know we have a couple other things we'll touch on, which I think I can highlight some other points, but yeah, those are some of the top things we learned in that meeting.
Yeah, no, fascinating. Yeah, what was the experience like? Were they eager to talk about it? Was it something that they were interested in? They seemed like dismissive about it. I know, I mean, given that Danes is one of the co-sponsors on it, I imagine pretty engaged. But yeah, was it nice to be there to I feel like from the sidelines here, we've been talking about SAFE for years, and for you to be there where it happens and to talk about it with the people that can make it happen. Did you walk away just generally feeling maybe better or just the same, given how long this has all taken?
I walked away feeling better. I mean, look, a little bit of like little Emily who was starstruck by DC growing up, wanted to be a constitutional lawyer myself growing up, like all of those things, like really, like I felt pretty starstruck sitting in the senator's office, sitting with the senator, and he was
It's
so
very cool.
yeah, he was so gracious, and was also clearly very, very informed on the matter. So he has taken time to understand this, and he is passionate about what it means to businesses in his state, which I know we've talked about Montana on the podcast before. And he doesn't profess to be this super cannabis advocate. He's very clear about where he sits in a comfortable zone on this, and I respect that. I feel like we have to work with people and understand their comfort zone around this issue, because not everybody overnight is going to become a cannabis advocate on the full scale. And I also appreciated that he actually gave us some thoughts on how we as an industry can be providing information if they need it. We held up. I would recommend to anybody who goes to the Hill, the first thing to do is understand who have been our allies, and we express our gratitude around that. And then further to that, I think just ask questions. Like the best thing we can do is ask questions and hear what they need to know, hear what they need to get from us. What can we do to help support the case? And I think if we go in and we assume things, then first of all, we won't learn anything. And second of all, we won't be an asset or a resource for the politicians or the lawmakers to make something happen. So we just asked questions. We asked, like, what are the third rail issues that you think create too many like blocks around this? What do you think could jump in front of this? What do you think? And it was interesting. He said safe in its own right, because it's about leveraging an infrastructure we know, and there's things we can talk about like AML, anti-money laundering, like guardrails and tax collection that this could provide. He said that in its own right is one of the only things in such a complex political environment that could get through the Senate through the regular order process, which means how it was introduced and now it's in the committee. They had a hearing, and then it's going to go to the floor, for discussion and then potential amendments and then a vote. Everything else has been kind of like, it wasn't handled that way last year, so he's like, this is actually an issue that can get the sufficient alignment. He said there are some people who are just never going to vote for anything that has cannabis around it. And that's just kind of like an old mindset. He's like, those aren't the folks we should even bother going after. But he gave some good feedback on other, specifically Republican senators, that we can do more to educate and inform. So I circled back to the ABA, and we're going to get meetings with them and continue to provide information. I think things like job growth in those markets, tax revenue that could be driven and collected more efficiently. Like there's a lot of, and in fact, the ABA providing a resource around what AML does look like once you get this into a legal and normal banking program. So all those things were really helpful. And so I felt like we came away with like little tasks too. So, having agency when change has felt so elusive, I think makes you feel a little better about the process. At least I feel like I can try to do something. Before I felt kind of impotent about what was going on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, I mean, since we last talked about it, it's been a few weeks. You've been gone doing all of this. Some stuff has happened around it. I want to kind of touch on some of these things. The hearings, we haven't really talked about the hearings.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you mentioned Sabbath. He obviously was at the hearing, seems to pop up somehow on all of these types of things. And I don't even want to touch on that because it's frankly quite frustrating. Some of the comments are the same old, right? But one, I think, interesting piece. I mean, when we talk about like from our industry, I saw that Dama Financial, kind of came out, and it was this Michelle Sullivan, their chief risk and compliance officer, and kind of seemed to step in it with the industry. It seemed very, I don't know, wasn't a great message coming from them. Essentially, she was saying that SAFE's going to be an insufficient regulatory framework. Thinks it should be more stringent than it is. Thinks that it will just ultimately lead to more confusion in the banking industry. This premature sense of resolution, which was a weird one. I know we all say that, and there's the concern of, is SAFE going to be the end of the road for federal legalization, or is it going to be the door cracking open to future things? And
Right.
she's arguing that everyone's just going to think it's done and we're good and we can move on. And then mention the point of cannabis companies already have banks, and I think certainly Dama helps with that, right, from their services. And I saw a lot of pushback on Twitter, I think for a good reason. It can be quite frustrating. We're such a small industry, and I feel like this industry can benefit so much from positive or any sort of federal change that I don't know, to just kind of throw this out there because it's not great for your business is not good. It's the rising tide lifts all boats stuff, right? And maybe you take on a little water, but it's like you got to adjust. And it seemed to be that was the sentiment, that people were pretty upset about those comments. And I've seen some stuff I haven't really followed up on, like where they stand, but it seemed like they backpedaled a bit on their
Mm-hmm.
position.
Yeah.
But I don't know what that means. Like you give a testimony at Congress, and then you're like, oh no, we don't really mean that. Oh, sorry. You know what I mean? That seems weird to do that. It's not like they're holding another hearing and you can go back in and be like, what I said, forget all that. But yeah, not ideal. And there was, some other good stuff, for it, I think. And all those are published. And I don't know, we maybe post a link to where those are so people can take a look. But yeah, anything else that you saw during the hearings that you wanted to call out? Anything interesting?
No, I mean, those are all really good points. And I think that, the general take is it wasn't a good look for the industry, what they did, what Dama did in particular, because I think it actually didn't get a good read in Washington. I don't think it showed well. It wasn't our best look. And, you expect they're going to have Sabbath on speed dial because he's just like the token prohibitionist still holding on to his outdated hysteria around this, and he's just wrong. He's always cites poor data, cherry picks it, the old
Mm-hmm.
standard classic. But and God, someone should help him with that haircut. But that's a sidebar. But I mean, he's really so whatever. It actually almost ended up making that argument, it was almost great because it kind of like looked what it was,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know. Subsequently, I've seen updates from people who've spoken to the team at Dama, and they said, "Oh, we just," they kind of pleaded unpreparedness, and all I can think is, what a missed opportunity. my team, like if we had a chance to testify before Congress, like I could only, or the Senate, I could only imagine the amount of work that would have gone into it. Just a war room set up, the amount of support we would be pulling in from the industry. This is where we need to pull together and show and put our best foot forward. I mean, it's, it is what it is, and some people just didn't even pay attention to it, but it wasn't a good look, and it wasn't a well-respected move within Washington. So I think it was very transparent, because the fact remains that, like, even with SAFE, there will still need to be technology platforms to help the banks, to help
Sure.
people to participate in this industry, and because the AML piece is an important one. And so I don't know, that idea of like the scarcity mindset resource, or yeah, the scarcity resource mindset around like trying to hold the business for yourself. I don't know about that, but I was disappointed. And
Yeah.
yeah, like I said, it wasn't well read on the Hill either.
Yeah. Yeah, disappointing for sure. And then beyond the hearings, last week, some news came out that a few groups or a coalition of groups were asking for some expansion of the
Hmm.
bill, particularly, I think it was the California Minority Alliance,
Hmm.
Minorities for Medical Marijuana, Women Grow, and the National Hispanic Cannabis Council. And what they were essentially asking for was a broader safety net around services and lenders, debt and equity financing, capital markets, investment services, insurance, broker dealers, fiduciaries, and credit card and payment processing. So kind of like, hey, the banking is a great step, but let's broaden the tent a little bit to allow all these things, which I can see, the credit card payment question, right? The uplisting question. These are like questions we all have. Like, it's not going to guarantee it. Is it start to move things forward? So they're asking about, can we guarantee it? And I know there's some concern to what you were saying earlier, like we're just adding stuff in. Schumer's comments, obviously, wanting to add stuff in. I think these are good things. I think that it would be nice to take credit cards. I think it would be nice for us as an organization to be able to take credit cards. Like, we're prevented from taking credit cards, which is crazy. From with most like online credit card services. So I get, why they asked for it. And I saw some pushback, out there about like, don't add anything, right? And I understand the pragmatic, like we just need to get something through, and the fear of like, yeah, we're going to add too many ornaments to the Christmas tree, and it's gonna tip over. But one thing that I see quite a bit out there is people are complaining like this industry needs to get organized and get its act together and align on something. But what I haven't seen, I mean, everyone says that, but I haven't seen anybody really talk about. It seems to be when those comments are made, it's kind of like the read I get is like everyone needs to align with like my view, you know what I mean, and be on,
Yeah.
on my side because I'm right. Versus like, how do we compromise, or like we see what you want here, like how do we work together to try and get a little of what we all need, not what one group needs over another group. And I don't know. I don't know where that stuff starts. And I know certainly we've got a long way to go with it. And I think that was some of the feedback when we had our last recording from Dane saying like this organization, or, the cannabis organizations need to come to Washington, need to lobby more, educate more, talk to people more. But it does seem a little fragmented and a lot of strong opinions out there. And when someone says, hey, can we expand this to add credit card payment processing? It's like, well, it's way too much. What are you guys doing? You're really pushing it. And then when I read like the groups that are asking for it, I mean, minority groups, Women Grow, National Hispanic Cannabis Council, it's not who you would think. It's not what I thought. I thought it would be like, oh, it's like the top tier MSOs or something, asking for uplisting, but it's not. It's like, organizations that represent most likely, a spectrum of clients. So I don't know. I think it's like a non really have a strong position here, but it seems like there needs to be the ability to ask for things without like blowing everything up or like panicking everybody. It's like, can we just talk about it? It's not like if you talk about it, it's like, oh, you said the, something that now we can't, now it's all over. Right. And maybe it's just because we've been dealing with this for so long and this concern of like adding too much or the way it's been structured. But I feel like we should be able to talk about it. Like, okay, well, they're asking for it. Okay, well, what exactly do you want? What kind of pain points do you have? Like, what is the minimum that you need? What should we be advocating for, instead of just like, hey, shut up over there because you're going to mess up the whole thing, right? It's like like let's talk about it, right? And then let's organize. Okay, well, this is why we think it's not going to happen, right? And get the information for people like yourself that have talked to the people that are in the room. And can we ask, like, hey, people are asking for these things. Are these the third rail subjects versus just like this kind of infighting? Because I know it's like, certainly SAFE's not going to fix it all, but it's like, well, I don't know. It's if it's not going to fix any of it or enough of it, like, let's talk about it, right? But kind of frustrating to see that stuff. But I don't know. I guess I just think we're all very sensitive at this point, and it's like we're almost there. And I understand, like, you don't want to rock the boat, but I do feel like it should be okay to have these conversations.
Yeah, it's like we're tending to this like little flame, and
Yeah, right.
we're trying to like warm ourselves by it, but like last year we put too much kerosene on it and like blew our hair off, but like we're just trying to like nurture this flame into a fire that becomes this like momentum, right? And I
Hmm.
feel like it's a very acceptable, especially given the cohort of different organizations that came together to make that request. To your point, I think from from what I've heard, the pushback around, for example, capital markets reform comes from this notion that then cannabis just becomes big business. But people who do not understand the flow through of the lack of capital markets access that our industry has truly need to go and take macroeconomics, microeconomics, like study economics and understand how these systems work. Because right now we have these incredibly depressed valuations that start in the public markets and trickle all the way through the industry. People have also suffered at the hands of the capital markets um, dynamics because of the lack of liquidity, because we don't trade on the exchanges. And what does that do? It scares investors away because they've been very badly burned by this market dynamic that exists. And I think that what that does, whenever I'm trying to do some like mentorship work or work with smaller businesses that are trying to put together funding for their businesses, like, there's just no capital here. And I was just talking to another investor who had tried to come into the industry, raise a fund, and just, you know what, couldn't get it done. And by the way, had the Rolodex to do it. If that person can't get it done, then there's no money coming in on the equity side, especially, meaning
Sure.
preferred equity, common stock, anything. And then also on a diverse front on equity. So people have done a lot of lending, and I think we now know where people have over leveraged their businesses. But this is a real aspect of an economic ecosystem that exists around this industry, or doesn't exist, I should say, for a lack of funding. But I think it is a good, if there's a cohort of organizations to come together to make this request, I think that's a good one to do it, because it's not who, might, like, if someone's anti that, it's harder to say they're anti that because of these groups coming together. Now, we did ask about capital markets. We didn't, and by the way, I want to be clear that in every meeting we had, we closed with our number one priority is to get SAFE passed. And if that is a narrow bill, we are in full support and full appreciation of that. And we will take that as a step of progress. But we just asked, like, how is that? Is that a third rail issue? In general, we didn't hear that it is necessarily, although that one is one to watch on the Democrat side because of the kind of anti big business notion around public companies and capital markets. Now, one could look at what's happened in Silicon Valley, where these companies stayed private for far, far too long and should have gone public a long time ago. And again, kind of like the rhyme to SAFE, which is all about transparency and access. If these companies, like, who was it that just had to like do that huge ballot of, it was at Stripe, who had to do the huge ballot of all of their options that were under, and then they had the tax
Oh, that
bill.
was yeah, that was Stripe, right?
Yeah, I
Because
mean,
yeah,
there's massive downside to companies staying private for too long, so you can inflate these valuations, and public markets require ESG and board structure and upper level management. They require transparency and reporting. They require, there's a lot of benefits to investors and to companies and to employees around having access to public markets. So it cuts both ways, and not to mention the amount of then talking about our economic impact of an industry. 100 billion could go much more. The guys at Verano were running around with us talking to some of these different groups too. It was nice to see our fellow colleagues out there, by the way. And Aaron Miles pointed out an interesting stat, which is it's all relative to that, or relevant to the economic impact, which is for every dollar spent in a dispensary, over $2 is spent in surrounding businesses when a dispensary opens.
That's interesting. It makes sense.
You go gas up your
Yeah.
car, you go
Right.
buy a soda at the nearby 7-Eleven. Who the hell knows? Maybe I make some bad decisions, go to Alice Olivia and buy a new wardrobe. I don't know, but there's a lot of things that can happen. So I'm pro asking the questions, but I think it's important to stay the course on, we're asking this question, but really what we want is for SAFE to get passed. And so we don't want to overdo it. We just want to understand. And that's all we're trying to do.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, right? We want SAFE, and if it's a narrow bill, then great, let's do it, right? But yeah, just doesn't hurt to have that conversation to kind of better understand what can work and what can't work, and what we can imagine possible and what we can't right now, right? So there's only, we can all just speculate, but if you can ask, like, get more insight into it, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. So it's interesting time for you to be there, right? And you mentioned SVB and the banking, and they were there, and at the same time, Sam Altman from OpenAI was there, and I don't know, did you bump into anybody? Did you see those guys? Did they get more attention than cannabis did at this point?
Well, they were definitely getting grilled. I don't know. I knew we were watching some of the Sam Altman screen, what do you call that, like his testimony or his Q&A, and he, I thought he articulated the points extremely well, and appreciate his depth of knowledge around this matter. I mean, I really do think it's like him and Elon and a few others who do really have incredible domain expertise on this artificial intelligence or machine learning, as it were, which you guys, for Headset's credit, has been talking about this since we met you back in 2015. So good for you guys being on front edge of that. It's an incredible, time to be alive, because, I think the parallel that's being drawn is that this and like nuclear weapon development are two things that are like the biggest innovations within like the last 100 years that could, I mean, space travel is amazing, but these two things, it's like, there's such incredible and vast changes in a technology and can be weaponized, and that's the big outlying concern, is like, are we going to lose control of this, just like the potential fear of losing control of nuclear arms, and can we like really hurt ourselves with this as a race? So but I listened to the All In podcast. I don't know if anyone else listens to it. And I do it to challenge my way of thinking. But there was an interesting debate about regulation around AI. And this was a big thing on the Hill. It was crazy because we were there. It was like banking reform as it relates to SVB and the other normal banks. And then us asking to be a part with banking reform. And then there's AI reform that was getting discussed. And one of the things that came up on the All In was this discussion around, well, does this create an access issue for innovation and for newer businesses? And I couldn't help but think about the parallels of our industry, where the cost of getting a license in these markets has been prohibitive, and it's created these separations in terms of what has created bigger and smaller businesses. And then there's been, like, in safe banking, I think it's something we were trying to talk about. And one of the things Danes was talking a lot about is like, they're trying not to make this about cannabis so much as it's just about business and safety and transparency, and putting it in the system. And so those are actually their biggest points. It's just business. And so, I think when we talk about regulation, we've experienced what the heavy hand of regulation can do, and how hard it is for small businesses, how expensive it is for small businesses, and how a lot of times it's also about who you know. It's why every single state that turns on, almost every single state has lawsuits that follow because of the licensing, who wins the licenses to start the process, and the shenanigans that could potentially go on, or the lever pulling. And we don't know who's done that more than anyone else. It's just a part of the way things go when there are licenses that are held through a form of bureaucracy. And I think it's just a really interesting parallel to something, we've lived through the time where cannabis and crypto have been talked about in the same breath. And now we're living through this time where AI is really being a driving force in change and technology. And just having also lived through a time of regulation, and then seeing an industry adjacent out there talking about what it would be like for them to be regulated, I just can see a lot of the same issues that we've dealt with in our own space. And I don't know, I'm not pro or against regulation at all on that. I'm kind of feeling out what I think about it or how it could be handled, but it's just like tales from the very overregulated world that we live in. I don't know what you think about all this.
It is funny how you're there in DC from a heavily regulated industry asking for more regulations and more clarity around, federal regulations. And they're coming from a space, tech, which has been traditionally unregulated. I think it's only been relatively recently, I think it was with Trump's election, that I think they finally woke up to, okay, well, the scale of, social media and are these posts coming from Americans? Are they coming from foreign adversaries? That's when, like, I think Facebook and everyone started getting scrutinized quite a bit, which is funny because I think Facebook's been excluded from the AI conversations, even though they've built like some pretty popular models that have gotten out there. But they're probably thankful to like have to avoid this one. But this stuff with OpenAI, it sounded like it was more proactive, like they're asking to be regulated. And yeah, I think I haven't listened to the All In podcast in some time, but I think that what you were saying about their argument and what I've heard is some people are saying, well, could be a bit of an unfair advantage, right? They have such a lead and they're asking for regulation and it'll box out everybody. So it's like getting ahead of it. And maybe, I mean, that would make sense from like a business strategy, right? You're just going to capture it. Now Microsoft owns it and Google probably owns it, but that's it. But I think that Sam Altman, and whether you believe him or not, like genuinely has some concerns about how it can be used in bad ways. And not like, I mean, there was the quote he said, I think like if it goes wrong, it could go really wrong. And there's that idea of like, it could be the end of us on one extreme. But I think there's also the extreme of just like tons of misinformation. I saw a thing today with like some AI generated Pentagon explosion, and then it got published on a blue checkmark Twitter, and then people thought that there was an attack happening, and it's just generated content, right? And so you could see even just there the impact it would have, like the kind of the tech regulation that was in conversation about abuse of social media platforms. Well, now if you don't know what's a human and what's not, I mean, and it's so hard to tell, with the output of these things. I think at the base case, like that's a risk, right? But yeah, pretty interesting to see. I think that with us, like the regulation, where in their case, maybe more regulation makes it harder for smaller groups to kind of get to where they need to get. For us, I think the regulation that we're talking about will help, right? Will help a lot of these businesses get access to banking in a more meaningful way. I know the argument of, oh, cannabis already has banking. And it's like, oh, sure, a few credit unions and a few small markets that maybe will support you. But, really true banking, right, can really open the doors for a lot of organizations that struggle with it. So just a crazy time, I think, to be there, and really cool that, I don't know, that you're there for it. Like when all this stuff is happening, it's pretty neat. And yeah, I guess 12-year-old Emily probably pretty stoked.
Pumped.
Thanks for listening to the High Rise Podcast, presented by Headset. For more information on Headset, visit headset.io.